To you Lisa and Justin Humphreys. Lisa Oakley is Professor of Safeguarding and Knowledge Exchange and Deputy Program Leader for the Masters of Science in Family and Child Psychology in the School of Psychology at the University of Chester. She's a chartered psychologist and chair of the British Psychological Society Safeguarding Advisory Group. Lisa's conducted research into issues of faith, safeguarding, abuse, and creating healthy cultures for the past 20 years and has focused on spiritual abuse. She's co-authored a number of articles and book chapters on these topics, has presented on these topics nationally and internationally, and has recently conducted a cross-faith research project exploring experiences of disclosing abuse experienced in a religious context. Justin Humphreys is CEO and head of Safeguarding Development at 31/8. Originally from Bristol, he's worked in a variety of social work and youth work settings for over 25 years. Most recently, before joining the charity in 2010, Justin worked for the largest children's charity in the UK. Previous to this, he worked in a range of local authority roles, most latterly at senior management level within a metropolitan borough council in the West Midlands. He's also served as a church pastor and is a passionate advocate for justice and authentic leadership. Let's turn our time over to them.
Yep, I think so. Thank you for inviting us. I just said to Justin, I see how you got your Bristol connection in there in your introduction. So we are going to, together this afternoon, look at a topic around examining cultures. So some of the messages that you've already heard, we're going to share, but actually probably from a slightly different lens to the ones they've heard. So if we can have the slides on, that would be really great. So just skipping on to the next slide would be brilliant. So one of the things we want to say right at the start, a lot of our work has been looking at this topic of spiritual abuse. And when we did some research in 2018, one of the things that we found in the survey that we did was that a lot of ministers completed that survey to tell us about their experiences of being abused, either by those people that were in higher positions of institutional power than them, or members of their congregation. And we just wanted to acknowledge that we're looking at, particularly focusing today on abuse by ministers, but we just want to acknowledge that many people leave ministry because of experiencing abuse. And our focus on cultures is partly because we think if we can start to create cultures that are safer and healthier, they are safer and healthier for all. And that's really, really important. If we go on to the next slide. So in the work on spiritual abuse, often people have said, well, when does spiritual abuse become spiritual abuse? When does it cross the threshold into abuse? So I developed this diagram that Justin's going to come back to, but somebody's called it my fruit polo diagram, and now that is what it's gone down as everybody remembers it as. But the green fruit polo is really healthy behaviour, and just as been said in the last one, so well by Rachel, we see lots of really healthy behaviour in our context. And actually one of the things we need to get better at doing is saying, what does good look like, and God, and how do we do more of that? But then if we go along that spectrum, we come to unhelpful behaviour, and we're all guilty of that from one time or another. We don't communicate well, we respond defensively, we upset somebody. Generally, we can recognise that, be helped to recognise it, and move ourselves back down that spectrum. If we move further up, we might get to start to see patterns of controlling behaviour, where people might check themselves before they speak to somebody. People have talked to me about spending hours writing a 3-line email in case they write one word wrong that might elicit a response. And then if we go right the way along the spectrum and we get to a form of psychological abuse of adults or emotional abuse of children that's characterised by this systematic pattern of controlling coercive behaviour, either in a religious context or with a rationale, or a religious rationale, or both, we might cross that threshold into spiritual abuse. And that's where myself and Justin have spent a lot of our lives researching and listening to people who have had experiences of spiritual abuse. And I want to say a huge thank you to people who shared experiences, because it is hugely costly to share your experience of abuse. To share in the context of research, you go back through that experience again. But we can't learn what we've learned without that. What we found in listening to those accounts over time is repeated messages. So we see people experiencing manipulation and exploitation. We see people experiencing extreme pressure to conform or to give service, but often that being equated to your relationship with God. So one person in my first piece of work said to me, I just thought that if I could be a good enough Christian, God would love me. But that was related to the expectation that was put on her of her behaviour and what she would give in that context. As Helen's already said, we see the use of sacred texts or teaching or values used to control people. So one of the people in my first piece of research talked about and said to me, I was told to keep my head down and my mouth shut and look on it as a case of keeping unity. And so she recognised the message of unity because it was a biblical message that she knew, but in her context it was used to keep her quiet about the abuse that she was experiencing. In a recent piece of research, the disclosure research, we asked people to choose images that represented their experiences of disclosure. And one person put a Bible on a dinner plate and she called it Eat the Words. And the verse that was circled was love keeps no record of wrongs. And she said when she was experiencing abuse as a child, she couldn't speak out because that scripture was, as she said, force-fed to her. So the use of scripture, the use of God as complicit. This is what God wants. This is what God's saying should happen. Touch not my anointed. If I had £1 for every time I've heard that verse in people's stories, I would be sadly incredibly rich. But the idea that you are anointed can be equated to you are unchallengeable, or you should not be challenged. So you're anointed and therefore unchallengeable. And then finally, we see the use of spiritual threats. God will not love you if. You will never go to heaven if. Those things are hugely powerful where faith really matters to you. And they live with people for a very long time after. We did some research on domestic abuse a couple of years ago with Restored and Broken Rights. And one of the things we saw there was the integration of spiritual abuse with other forms of abuse and harm. So in the survey, 199 people completed it. 71% of them had experienced domestic abuse. 61% of them said spiritual abuse was part of the experience of domestic abuse. And interestingly, the use of scripture was used both by perpetrators of faith and without faith. So the person might have a faith, but the perpetrator might not, but they still might use scripture as part of it. So when we come to look, if we go on to the next slide, when we come to look at cultures, what do we find? This diagram, if we've got it on the next slide, it's coming. I'm making him run now, sorry about that. This diagram, if we look at it, is something that was based on, you may have heard of the Tiny Ted's nursery where there was abuse of children. This is going back some time now. And a researcher that looked at that wanted to work out what had happened in that experience. And what they found was that there were concentric circles. So there was the abuse that was happening and being perpetrated by the abuser that the child was experiencing. But that was happening within a nursery room, that was happening within a nursery, that was happening within a geographical context, that was happening within a broader social context. And they said, bless you, they said all of those layers were really important to understand what was the culture. What was the culture in that room? What was the culture in that nursery? What was the culture in that geographical location? And in the work on spiritual abuse, but not only spiritual abuse, we've found that it's really, really important to understand the personal experience that somebody has. What happens to them really matters. But then to look beyond that. So it might be that you're then looking at the culture of a house group or a youth group or a section of a church. What is the culture there? What is being taught in that culture that allows abuse to be perpetrated, maintained, and not disclosed? Then you might look at the local church context. What's happening in that culture? Then you might want to look at the denominational context. What is happening in denominational contexts, both that is harmful or potentially, but also that's helpful. And then, and I'm going to come back to this, but what other interconnectedness is happening? So you might be a church that's part of a broader Christian community connection or context. So we're an independent church, but we belong to something called Kairos Connection. So what's the culture there? But examining our culture really, really matters if we want to understand how did abuse happen in this place in the first place? How did it get maintained? Because in spiritual abuse, often we see abuse that has happened over a long period of time. And so you might have a whole stream of people who have experienced that. But often those people will leave the context and then other people will experience it. So we need to examine our cultures and ask these questions. What's valued in my culture? What helps create the culture? What helps maintain it? And what features are there of healthier, safer cultures where I am? And then if we go on to the next slide, one of the things that I think has become really clear in the work is that our responses to those who experience abuse are framed by our culture, belief and attitudes. There is a direct link between the cultures that we create and the way that we respond to people who experience abuse. So in the project that we did on disclosure, some people chose images that represented reasons why they disclosed, and some chose pictures that represented reasons why they couldn't disclose. And some people chose images, and some did all of them, about how they were responded to. And the two pictures, and I'm sorry I haven't got them on the slides, but I will describe them, that really struck with, well, there's lots, but two pictures relevant to today, I think. One is of a volcano. And actually, a number of people chose a volcano, and that volcano represented injustice. And they said that when they came to tell their experience of abuse, what happened to them was that the institution was protected, or the individual was protected, at the expense of them. And that volcano was the injustice of that. And for the two other pictures, one was a carpet that somebody chose, and they said that their disclosure was just swept under the carpet. Nobody wanted to hear it. Nobody wanted to listen to it. And somebody else chose an image, and it's so powerful because the face is missing, and you can just see the mouth like this. And they called it shush. And they said this: I was banging on the doors of the church to take notice of what was happening to me. And all they told me was, shut up and go away. And this is a bit of a, I guess, follow on from the last one, but one of the themes that we found in that research was about policies and practices. And for some people, actually, safeguarding was really, really important. We did have somebody say, I get cross when people say negative things because it was really important to me. But for some people, they found that the policy either wasn't there, or it wasn't followed, or it was inconsistent, or it was damaging to them. So there's some work, I think, for us to do around that. If we go into the next slide. We've got it up there. Oh, I should. Yeah, thank you. So one of the other things that I think is really important to think about when we're thinking about how does this happen and what do we do to address it, is to think about the different ways that power operates. So when we do training on this, we often get people to think about the kinds of power they use when they are influencing and when they're following. Okay, so every morning I am delivered a cup of tea. It's great. That's what my husband does every morning. But one morning he forgot. So I just sent a little message down. It was just a little gift. And the first one was a picture of an earl. And the second one was just grey. And so there was this kind of, message of Earl Grey and then a question mark. But we influence each other. So when in training we say, you can influence people because you can reward them. And in church context, you can reward people in all kinds of ways. You can give them positionality, you can give them status, you can give them time and attention. You can coerce people. You can take things away from people. You might have legitimate power if you are in a position in that context. Relational power is really key. My husband works for the church, and once some of the young people at church, a talent show, created a song that said, "Everybody loves Tim," not Lisa. Everybody loves Tim. And he said he had to reflect on that because of his role as pastoral worker. There's a relational power that he has that he really has to reflect on. Informational power, holding the information. I guess expert power is a little bit what we're hearing today. We've done this research, gives you a certain degree of power. Charismatic power, the power of personality. I'm going to come back to that. None of those are actually all bad in themselves. You might look at coercive power and say, well, that's not good. But actually, the reason you wear a seatbelt is because the law came in to say that if you didn't, that was a bad thing. But we get people to reflect. And one of the keys to addressing this is to start to talk in our communities and our cultures about power and how it operates. If we can go on to the next slide, that'd be really helpful. One of the things I did, and this comes back to something that Helen said earlier, is I actually went through some lessons learned reviews and other reviews and looked at what are some of the key messages that come out of those where things have gone very badly wrong and people have been abused. And these were some of the things that have, that reflect some of the things that have already been said. But leadership on a pedestal was a really strong message in lots of things. What's happening in our cultures where we put leaders on pedestals, and that means they're unquestionable, unchallengeable, but we're also not supporting them. One of the features of a healthy culture is a culture in which people are accountable and supported. I've talked about personality. It comes across really strongly. The Pilavachi review is a really good example of that. Charisma, personality, and power. We've talked about the power of success. Often in our context, success equals numbers. How many? I used to be deaconess for community and evangelism at our church, and the first question I would get asked after any event is, how many people came? How many people came? That was a measure of whether it was successful or not. But when we do that, when things then become successful numerically, we can stop looking at what is happening there. Holding and giving status, that was really, in the reviews that I looked at, that was really clear that the person held status and they could give away that status and they could take it back. And that was really powerful. We've talked about a lack of accountability. In a number of the reports, they talked about a lack of internal and external accountability. Interconnection, I've talked a little bit about this, but it's really important. One of the reports says none of the perpetrators would have had the degree of influence they had if they were not also part of wider and interconnected spheres of influence. There's something about that interconnectedness, and we were talking about this over lunch, weren't we, about how people might be invited to speak at Spring Harvest, and then they're the person that's invited to speak somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else. It's not a bad thing in and of itself, but it does mean you have a huge sphere of influence. And then that minimization, and I've written down, Helen, just Mike. But actually you could replace that name Mike with lots and lots of names. It's just such and such. And actually that starts at our local church level, where somebody comes in and somebody maybe responds not particularly positively because they've sat in their seat that they obviously own, and we say, oh, that's just such and such. It's, you see, we do it at local level, and then it goes up and up and up, and it comes down and down and down. So then, what are some of the things that we can do? Well, if we go on to the next slide, one of the things that I think is really important is reflection. One of the litmus tests for me is often, can people reflect? Actually, if people can reflect, then often they can address behaviour, but often the defensiveness, we're all a bit defensive at first, but usually we can reflect. But when I'm delivering training, I often ask people this question: would I want to be led by me? What is really good about the way that I lead, and what is really problematic, or what are some of my weaknesses? I can stand up here and talk like this, but what you don't know is I am always incredibly nervous before I speak, always. I'm a nightmare, and Justin had to bring me today. I was quite well behaved today, but usually I lose everything. I'm not very confident. I know that about myself. I know things about myself. There's lots more to learn, but we need to be reflective. We've done some work. We're going to skip through the next couple of slides because Justin's going to talk about them a bit more. But we've done some work on characteristics, so we can leave it on that one, of a healthy culture, and Justin's going to talk a bit more about that. But I just wanted to give you an example of something we did at a local church level, because culture is not just national or regional, it's local. So we decided, well, what my poor leaders in my church have me to contend with. So we did a series on creating healthy cultures. And so what we did was we actually developed a series of sermons about different aspects of a healthy culture. And we rolled it out across all of our age groups. So we did it with our children, our young people and our adults. And then we had some follow-up questions and we ended up with a healthy charter. How do we want to behave in this space? How do we want to be with each other? What I think is really important about that is that we wanted to include the children because their voices really matter. But if we want to change things for the future, we have to start. It's great to have conferences like this, but what are we doing at every level with every generation to talk about these things? And actually, do you know what we found? Some of our young people and children were really switched on because they're having these kinds of conversations. And it was a really easy conversation, but it was so important to have. One thing we touched on in that series, we started actually, our first characteristic that we looked at was safeguarding as a foundation. And we did a whole session, whole Sunday, right from the youngest to the oldest, about safeguarding. We used the Rory the Lion resources with our children. But what was really interesting when I did that review of reviews was that sometimes there has been a split between what we see as safeguarding and ministry, and we say they're two different things. And one of the things when I looked at the reviews that I heard so many times was the gospel matters more than anything. And what that meant is if you're successful, that's seen to be the gospel being successful, and you don't look at anything else that is happening within that context. And that message of the gospel, and it led me to the question, I don't even know what that gospel is when it's talked about like that, but it was really revered so highly. And the last bit of me, before I pass you over to Justin, is just one more slide, which is a quote from the study that I've just finished. And one of the people within that study had quite a negative response from someone when they first disclosed. And that person later went back to them and said, you know what, I got that wrong. And I'm really, really sorry. And the participant said to me, you know what, Lisa, when we know better, we do better. And it got me to thinking that we have learned a lot from people who have had experiences of abuse. And now that we know better, we really do have to do better. And I'm hoping Justin's going to help you to think about how to do that.
Thanks, Lisa. If we could move on to the next slide, Brandon, that would be great. Thank you. So I think we've talked about culture quite a lot. In fact, I think we've probably heard that word used in every presentation so far, if I'm not wrong. And the more I do in this space, the more I find myself talking more about culture. Yes, safeguarding is important. For some people, there is a full connection and investment with that. For others, it's more problematic for a number of reasons, and that's okay. But I find myself talking more and more about this notion, this concept of safer, healthier cultures. So if we think about the characteristics that we might want to display and work hard to develop as individuals, culture, in a sense, is an organizational, environmental, or broader representation of that. It is how we do things. It is who we are. It is why we do things the way we do them. So I spend my time increasingly talking into this particular space and using this analogy, which is about the time that we might invest in tending to the ground in which we plant the seeds of our best intentions. So as this graphic displays, our culture might be represented by a whole range of different things, be it our beliefs, our attitudes, our behaviors. But the things that we plant into our environment are all important. but they must rest in soil which is capable of allowing them to grow. So perhaps think for yourself for a moment as to what it might be to be a gardener. I'm not a great gardener, I have to confess. I love looking at a nicely tended garden. I'm not so keen on doing the hard work to get it looking great and to maintain it that way. But actually, that is exactly what we need to do if our cultures are to be safe and healthy. We need to make sure that we've spent time before we start planting seeds, making sure that the soil doesn't contain toxins that are likely to threaten the early growth of what we plant. We need to make sure that there are not remnants of roots of the sorts of things that we don't want to grow, that in time may grow alongside that which we plant and threaten its survival. We might want to spend time putting fertilizers or nutrients into the ground to alter the pH balance maybe, so that we know that what we put in is going to survive. We moved into a new house a couple of years ago, and for those of you that have done that, typically you get a back garden that's just laid to lawn. There's nothing but lawn. And that's what we had in our place. The difficulty was what was previously in the ground had a habit of growing through our lawn. That was a bit of a problem. And in this case, it was thistles. Spiky, nasty, tough old thistles. And I spent an afternoon on one occasion trying to get these thistles out. It was hard work. But I also made the mistake of not wearing gloves. So I got a few of these thistles in my hands, in my fingers, and they were a pig to get out. They caused me pain for quite a long time. But I was thinking, as I was reflecting on that, isn't that so true of the things that we often encounter? When we're having to do this hard work, both organisationally and individually, it can be painful. So there's a message in there about how we look after ourselves in that process. It's all part of the culture that we might want to create. So making sure that we are attentive to our cultures is not a one-off event. Because as with any garden, as soon as we've turned our backs, you know what happens. The weeds start to grow, don't they? So we've got to keep going at it. It's not a once done job. And maybe that's a bit of a hard one for us all to accept, but it is the truth, I believe. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Just returning to this idea of the spectrum of behaviour, which I always used with permission of Dr. Lisa Oakley, because it is her work. But what we have to appreciate is that behaviour plays a key part. There is an inextricable link between who we are as people and what we see in our cultures. We are part of the culture that we try to create. And it's important for us to acknowledge, Lisa and I have spoken about this many, many times. We call this the myth of homogeneity. And is that we have a leaning or a predisposition, if you like, to want to categorize or pigeonhole people. And we want to do that in ways that cause us the least challenge, the least emotional resistance, if you like. But the reality is that as individuals, as broken people, we all have the ability to both do good things and things that aren't so good. And sometimes those things become harmful to others. And I think if we acknowledge that, it makes it easier to face the uncomfortable reality that somebody that we thought we knew well and love can do pretty awful things. And that's one of the key challenges that we're often all faced with. I think the accounts that Rachel and Lee gave us were testimony to that fact. It's difficult because sometimes we have to face the fact that we didn't know people as well as we thought we did. The flip side is that we are capable, for the most part, most of us, if we haven't gone too far down the spectrum towards the right-hand end, we are capable of modifying our behavior. We are capable, hopefully, of hearing the challenge, as difficult as that might be, and preventing ourselves from moving towards behaviors which become entrenched and embedded. But it takes courage and it takes humility for us all to be in that place and to acknowledge that for those who present themselves open and accountable, that is a courageous step. I think Lee, again, and Rachel spoke really well to those points. So I think it's important that we remember that none of us are all good. And none of us probably are all bad, if I can put it in those polarized terms. When I do training on these sorts of things, I often have a slide which has a whole range of different faces of well-known Christian leaders. I haven't got it today, but it would have faces like Bill Hybels, Mark Driscoll, Peter Ball, Jonathan Fletcher, John Smythe. We could probably add Mike Pilavachi to that now. Ravi Zacharias, Michael Olorunbi. The list goes on and on. You may know some of those names, you may not know them all. The reality is that many, if not most of those people did some great things, contributed an incredible amount to people's experience of God, Christianity, faith. But they also fell. They also succumbed to patterns of behavior which took them down a very harmful path and damaged an awful lot of people. So let's just bear in mind the reality of who we are as people. Because it's not often the clear-cut stuff that we're left challenged by, is it? It's the areas of grey. It's the blurring of the boundaries, if you like, between what is helpful and what is harmful. So often when we are pulled into situations, we are left facing the challenge of, well, okay, this is not, as far as we know, criminal behavior, but it's harmful and abusive nonetheless. So what do we do with that? Are our policies and our procedures sufficiently set up to enable us to deal with those situations effectively, robustly, fairly, equitably? They're not always, sadly. But where they are there to guide us in those situations. So there's lots for us to think about in this space, and it was interesting. Rachel, you gave the example of the chap that turned up with the book that Lisa and I wrote together. Equally, we receive calls at 31.8 pretty regularly from people who say, well, we've read the book and we think X or Y or Z. This person is guilty of whatever. We think we've seen spiritual abuse. We believe we've been subject to spiritual abuse. And in many cases, the answer to that is yes, they probably have. But increasingly, unfortunately, the answer is, well, I'm not sure that is actually the case. Because these things are nuanced. And I think it requires us to keep digging in, to keep listening to the accounts of victims, survivors, those who have worked around the subject area, and be prepared to keep learning and developing what we do. Lisa and I will often say to people, this is not a closed book. This is not done with. We are still learning. Even the term spiritual abuse is contentious in some circles. Many people don't like it. That's okay. As long as we're not preventing ourselves from stepping into exploring the lived experience of individuals who have come to great harm. Okay, maybe if we move on to the next slide. Thanks, Brandon. So Lisa's already shown us a slide with a list of things that she has picked up from the various lessons learned reviews, case reviews, other such pieces of work. And I've done a similar exercise. And yeah, maybe this will feature in some publication in the future, who knows. But one of the things that I sought to try and understand was, what are the key things that seem to be missing in the leadership practices and styles of these individuals, many of whom I've just referenced? And it struck me that amongst probably a wider range of things, there were 4 key things in terms of the characteristics or the style of leadership that were absent. And they're these. A little bit corny, but have we got what it takes to lead well? Do we have humility? Sufficient humility that says, actually, I don't know all the answers. I'm not going to get it right every time. I am going to make mistakes. That is the reality. So the environment which, in a sense, does not allow mistakes to be made is an environment that will actually ultimately encourage cover-up. If people do not feel safe to own the fact that they have made mistakes, then those mistakes are going to be hidden. They're going to be kicked under the rug. Problem is, the longer you keep kicking things under the rug, the bigger the pile underneath the rug gets, and eventually it will trip us up. So humility that says, I don't have all the answers, is absolutely key to this, and something that we see as lacking in many who have been found wanting. When I onboard new people at 31.8, whatever role there is they come into, I'll spend some time with them in their early days. And those sorts of things like, I'm telling you now, I'm going to make mistakes and I don't have all the answers. I need you to work with me, are the kinds of messages that I will give. Because it's only fair and reasonable that we set that expectation from the beginning. And with that, I create an invitation to say, if ever I say or do something which causes issues, concerns, or queries for you, I'd like us to talk about it. And that has brought about some difficult conversations. I don't mind admitting that. But it's a healthier place to be, I think. We talked about accountability again, I think, in many of the presentations already today. But it's another key ingredient that sadly we've seen all too often missing. But what do we mean by accountability? Because enforced accountability can be one of those things that is used to manipulate, coerce, and control. But accountability, I think, as Lee was talking about earlier on, that is willingly, voluntarily entered into, is a life-giving exercise. And it's important that we do it. So seeking out those people who we know will be truthful and candid with us is all important. I have a couple of individuals who I have that relationship with also. And I picked them deliberately because I know not that they're just going to say, yes, Justin, yes, that's right. Of course, that's how it is. They're the kind of people who will say, well, actually, I'm not sure that is true. Or, Justin, you know that thing that you said, I'm not sure that it landed the way that you thought it did. So these are the sorts of people that we need around us. Not yes people, but people who love us, know us, and are prepared to challenge us where necessary in a constructive and positive way. Third piece, vulnerability. Now, we need to be really clear what we mean about this. We don't mean leaders bleeding all over the carpet in front of those that they are tasked with leading. But we are talking about an appropriate level of openness, transparency, and candor The willingness to actually say, again, I've made a mistake. Or I'm feeling really challenged about this particular situation. Helps to keep us grounded, helps to remove the pedestal that we often set our leaders upon. Because actually, they've just been tasked with a pretty difficult job. But we're all just people, trying to get through life, doing the best we can, responding to the call that God has given to us, however we might want to phrase it. So that sense of vulnerability is all important. And then finally, empathy comes into play. As we are thinking more and more about this situation of harm and abuse within the context of church, what we've lost sight of all too often is that actually it's people at the center of these situations. Process, procedure, structures, training, they're all important. But they shouldn't eclipse the fact that we're working with, ministering to, laboring alongside people. So empathy is all important. And I think if we reflect on the passages that we read of Jesus in Scripture, we're told that Jesus was moved with compassion. Compassion is a step further on from empathy. It means we feel something, we see something, but we then are compelled to act, to step into, to come alongside, to make a difference in. So how we activate our sense of empathy, how we challenge our own sense of dysregulation in the challenging moments is all important. It's hard work. Let's make no bones about it. But I think if we saw these 4 things amongst others, and if we practiced them harder, we might see fewer challenges. If we could just move on to the next slide. This slide's a little bit busy. Please forgive me for that. This is taken from Escaping the Maze, or this is actually an evolution of the framework that we've written about in Escaping the Maze. And it looks at 3 different areas that might be helpful for us to explore as we're looking at what safer, healthier cultures and systems look like. And it's by no mistake that the first element that we look at is about listening well. What time do we take to listen to the things that are being said about us, about our environments, about our culture? Are we prepared to take on board the negative as well as the positive? And are we prepared to demonstrate that actually listening then gets fed into action? So listening well is followed by communicating well. How often do we hear positive messages that challenge us to think about what it means to create safer environments? Where we can see the mandate for that throughout Scripture, how we see it modeled. Because if we don't see it, if we don't hear it, we don't necessarily know, or we don't have confidence that it exists. We then come on to managing power. We talked about power an awful lot. The recognition that we all have it in some shape or form in different contexts, but knowing where power exists, where the influence is held, where and how it is being used, who it is being given to, as well as who it is being held by and entrusted to, are all important. Building transparent structures. I mean, all these different learning reviews that we've talked about to some degree have also been challenged by a lack of transparency in the structures that exist, the governance arrangements that are there. We've seen what we call shadow or ghost structures in place. This is what the kind of the chart says. This is what the policy or the procedure says happens. But actually, in reality, it looks a little bit different. It's like this. The good governance piece, again, is all important. And I know that we often in church struggle with the difference between spiritual leadership and organizational governance. Don't get me wrong, that can be complicated. and there are overlaps. And it's probably right that there are some overlaps. But sadly, what we see time and time again when we've done pieces of work is that when we've concluded and provided a really challenging report often, the degree to which the leadership of a church and its trustees or governance body are able to work together to take forward any recommendations that they are left with, it can be a really challenging space. And sometimes it's made so much harder by the lack of good governance. People were not held to account when they ought to have been. Systems were not in place to guide people as to what they could expect. So it's all important that we get those things right. And then finally, that we should model those safer behaviours. If an environment does not see safer behaviours modelled by its leaders, then something has really gone wrong. And dare I say it, we risk being hypocritical in the ways in which we conduct ourselves. Say as I do, but don't do as I do. I haven't got that right, have I? There's a phrase there. Thank you, Lisa. Do as I say, not as I do. It's really important that we're attentive to that. Because for those people who will find refuge in a new church, having come out of one that was harmful, are going to be looking for these indicators. And if we are committed to making sure that our cultures and our environments are safer, we have to be prepared to do this work. Whether it's this framework or whether it's another, doesn't really matter. But something along those lines would be all important. I'm just going to finish because I think we're a little bit over time. The final slide provides 6 elements of what we call the Safer Places Pledge. We developed this some years ago as a way of encouraging leaders in different communities and settings to commit to the things that might help combat some of the difficulties that we found. So we're asking leaders in different contexts to commit to speaking up, to commit to putting survivors first, genuinely putting survivors first, above the institution, above the setting. That we then move on to making change happen. Are we committed to being part of the change? Because that means we have to model those safer behaviours that I've talked about. I've got a little thing here which I think we'll probably make available to people, maybe in the next break, Helen. We go on to talk about committing to concealing nothing, being deliberate about making sure that we are transparent where that is appropriate in all possible situations, that we take responsibility for our actions, and that ultimately we hold each other to account. So maybe there's a challenge there. Can we commit to these things? Because if we can, we might stand a chance of creating environments where harm and abuse are less possible, more clearly identified where they do happen, and that we can be more resolute in our response when it has. Thank you.